Hi everybody, in this second video from our unit Business and the Environment, I'll be talking briefly about some of the things that government can do to protect the environment. So how can government protect the environment? First, let's just note that it's true in the United States but also around the world that government regulates business activity in order to protect the environment. So we'll be looking first at some of the things that government is already doing. By setting common standards, government can take the cost of pollution control out of competition. Governments can also create or provide economic incentives and offer systems for resolving disputes. So in short, government has a lot of authority and also a lot of resources, and can therefore is therefore looked at by many people as an important, if not critical, actor for protecting the environment. So in the United States, this is done primarily through the Environmental Protection Agency, not exclusively, but the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, is the agency charged with pollution control, and it was established in 1970. So in the United States, the federal government regulates in three primary areas of environmental protection. This includes air pollution, water pollution, and land pollution, including solid waste and hazardous waste. So let's just look briefly at what government is already doing in each of these areas. So with regard to air pollution, which occurs when more pollutants are emitted into the atmosphere than can be safely absorbed and diluted by natural processes. So in other words, our planet has the ability to sort of protect us from ourselves by absorbing some of the harmful things we put into the atmosphere, but only to a certain extent. Okay, so in 1970, the Clean Air Act was passed, and this established national air quality standards. Okay, we see, though, many other examples since then of additional sources of air pollution, most recently in California from the wildfires. So this is also a problem for human health and related to human activity, including the management of PG&E's power lines, as well as the issues associated with globalization that are increasing the risk of wildfires. So, air pollution is the first. Second, water pollution. This occurs when more wastes are dumped into waterways than can be naturally diluted and carried away. There are rules on the books governing water pollution as well. The Water Pollution Control Act from 1972 to establish national goals and timetables for clean waterways. There are also rules about drinking water. So the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1974 and then updated in 1976 establishes national standards for drinking water. So we see standards being developed first regarding air pollution and now also regarding water pollution. So third, land pollution, the contamination of land by both solid and hazardous waste. Again, there are rules on the books governing land pollution, including the Pesticide Control Act, which requires the registration of and restrictions on the use of pesticides. A lot of the issues associated with land relate to this concept of environmental justice, the effort to prevent inequitable exposure to risk, such as from hazardous waste in disadvantaged communities. So there are a lot of issues of equity that come up when we decide as a society where to put hazardous waste that we produce. This is the not in my backyard idea that environmental justice is tied to. You have people who have a more privileged place in the political system, have more wealth, have more education, have more access to influential individuals, that sort of thing, end up not living around these sites that can be harmful to human health. And so the people who end up taking on these risks are those who lack those kinds of resources, right? So disadvantaged communities bearing more of this exposure than others, and that's not right according to many people. So the sites that are most dangerous to human health because of the toxic waste that's there are denoted as Superfund sites. This is based on legislation passed in 1980. So it identifies the most dangerous areas in the country and then sets a timetable for cleaning those areas up and making them safe for human activity again. So we can see in the link that I've provided a list of Superfund sites that might be close to where you live. This doesn't mean these places are dangerous. In many cases, they've been cleaned up well and are safe again. But nevertheless, you can see all of the different areas that have had these kinds of issues in the past. Okay, so there are additional regulations governing pollution of different types. I won't go into detail in all of them, but just so you know that there are many things that the government already does and has been doing to protect the environment in these ways. So many of these standards that I just talked about, albeit very briefly, that came about in the 1970s, which is referred to by many people as the golden age of environmental protection, when a lot of new rules were made. These are referred to as command and control regulations. Command and control regulations. So what this means is that the government commands business to comply with a certain set of standards, and then often controls their choice of technology. So it tells companies what to do. The government is telling companies what to do and how to do it. Okay, so this is controversial in some ways, and we'll see now some of the ways in which government has responded to criticisms of command and control regulation by trying to adopt maybe more flexible approaches. But nevertheless, some people feel very strongly that this is required in a lot of areas, that government has to set minimum standards for businesses as well as for individuals in society, and then penalize those who fail to meet those minimum standards. But more recently, regulators have been under pressure to use market-based mechanisms. So this includes cap and trade, which are tradable permits for emissions, emissions fees and taxes. The more you pollute, the more you pay, as well as government incentives for rewarding good behavior. So taking some of the coercion out of government regulation, in other words, rather than just forcing companies to abide by certain minimum standards, it tries to put in place incentives for them to go above and beyond what's legally required. So in a cap and trade system, you can only emit let's say carbon dioxide into the environment if you have a permit. And so companies that can adopt new technologies and processes and emit less end up with permits that they could then sell to others, and it creates a marketplace, but also an incentive for some organizations to become more efficient. So similar with taxes and fees, if you're charged by tonnage of emissions into the atmosphere, there's an incentive there to pay less by reducing your emissions and so on. So this is a more recent trend in the government regulation of the environment. So other alternatives to command and control regulation include information disclosure, which we've talked about in other contexts. So this is sometimes referred to as regulation by publicity or regulation by embarrassment, where the government encourages companies to pollute less by publishing information about the amount of pollutants individual companies emit each year. Civil and criminal enforcement is another alternative to command and control regulation. Threats of fines or imprisonment could be used as a deterrent as well in getting people to improve their behavior. With all of these different approaches, command and control regulation, market-based solutions, the ones I just mentioned as well, it is important to consider the trade-offs. In other words, each of these approaches has advantages but also disadvantages. So, for example, command and control regulation makes compliance mandatory. That's a good thing. The government is forcing companies to comply. However, it is expensive to implement, and it may not improve companies' performance once compliance is achieved. In other words, in a command and control environment, what is incentivizing companies to go above and beyond that minimum amount threshold set by the government? So, you can't emit more than this amount. Well, what if you wanted to produce far less? What incentive is there for that? There isn't any. Market-based mechanisms, on the other hand, are less expensive compared to command and control, and they give companies more flexibility, which companies appreciate. But enforcement is difficult, and companies may feel that they have a license to pollute. So, for example, with the case of emissions fees, what if a business is perfectly happy to emit at very high levels and simply pay the fees? That's a challenge in setting up that kind of regulatory system to get the price right of the fee so that companies are actually incentivized to do what you want them to do, which is emit less. Okay, so there are challenges to market-based systems as well. Similarly, with information disclosure, yes, this is also less expensive, but not all companies are going to be motivated by this fear of embarrassment. So for particular companies that feel like, okay, look, people don't really know who we are, we're not a consumer-facing business, being identified on some government website as not being in compliance with a certain regulation or not doing a certain thing, that's not really going to harm us. So you're kind of assuming that companies are going to feel like this is an important thing to do in order to preserve their reputation, and that may not always be the case. Finally, with regard to civil and criminal enforcement, this may not be an effective deterrent if the penalties are too weak. So similar to the issue of emissions fees, setting criminal penalties, you have to be strict enough that the penalties work as an effective deterrent, but not too strict that seems disproportionate to the offense that was committed. So these are difficult things to establish as well. So in other words, there are many different things that the government can do in order to reduce pollution. And it's important for you to have a sense of what these different options are and what the trade-offs are between each one.